start. I'm Professor Jennifer Dill, Director of TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center here, and Professor of Urban Studies and Planning. I am the guest introducer for today's Friday seminar because I'm happy to introduce Dr. Arlie Adkins. He is an alum of Portland State University getting his PhD here in urban studies. I was very happy to serve as his dissertation chair on his committee. He is now an assistant professor of planning at University of Arizona. I have to make sure I don't accidentally say Arizona State. That would be bad. And we're very happy to have him here with us today, visiting from Arizona, to talk about some of his new research that he has done since he left Portland State. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Arlie.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Great to be back in Portland. As Jennifer said, this is a building that I have spent a lot of time in. Good to see a lot of familiar faces here. Today I'm going to be talking about a research project that is just wrapping up, but I'm going to be starting out talking, sort of really framing the issue here and talking about the importance of affordable housing when we're thinking about transportation planning. And you may pick up a little bit of kind of self-reflection in this talk as I've gone from someone being very much entrenched in transportation planning, starting to dabble in transportation and land use, and then really, as my research has progressed, really recognizing the importance of affordable housing to all the things that we talk about as transportation planners and transportation engineers. I want to start out, if I can make this work, by thanking TREC. So I was thinking on my way up here the other day that I think it was 10 years ago this semester when I was working at TriMet in their planning department that I started watching some of these seminars in this room, and it was sort of my gateway drug. Soon after, went down to Berkeley for a master's degree and then ended up back here for a PhD. So I just want to say that this is a really great service, and I do hope that there's some people out watching online. But yeah, thanks for a good decade. And I guess it wasn't even OTREC then. CTS, OTREC, TREC. Yes. Okay, so let's begin. So I want to start out talking about some of the basic relationships that we talk a lot about as transportation planners and transportation researchers. So there's been a lot of effort to understand the relationship between the built environment. We're talking about things like transit access, infrastructure, urban design, destinations, density, understanding the relationship between those built environment characteristics and travel behavior. So mode choice, physical activity, trip characteristics, and frequency of those trips. Also, I think increasingly, there's also an understanding of how the outcomes of this travel behavior have a really large impact on people's lives. So things like health outcomes of transportation, economic impacts on individuals and communities, opportunity in terms of access to jobs and other services, and also on the safety side of things, injury and death are certainly very serious outcomes that are related to this built environment travel behavior and outcome relationship. So focusing in on the outcomes for a second, it's really important to recognize the disparities that we see in some of these outcomes. So I just want to go through a handful of examples. So in terms of economic outcomes, low-income households often spend a much higher percentage of their household incomes on transportation. So this is evidence that allowing lower-income households to have more economical transportation choices could have a disproportionately large impact on helping those households financially. In terms of opportunity and access to jobs, there's a lot of research on the mismatch between where jobs are located and where housing exists for people at certain incomes. So this map is a little bit difficult to see, but this is just an example from Milwaukee, so showing in black some of these large employment centers. And then the red lines here are the transit network in Milwaukee. So you can see the disconnect between the transit system in Milwaukee and where the jobs are located. And then here, this is a story that made the news within the last year. This guy in Detroit who was making a 21-mile walking commute in Detroit because there was no transit access to the place where he was working. So you can just see the map here and showing this really epic journey that this guy made every day. So in terms of health, and this is an area where I think there's a growing interest in the relationship between transportation and health, and it's an area where my research is definitely heading. So many chronic diseases are associated with physical activity, many of the chronic diseases that are associated with physical activity are disproportionately impacting lower income and minority communities. So low-income people are more at risk of complications from transportation air quality problems as well. So we see a lot of this with asthma. So here we've got sort of two connections to the transportation world in terms of that physical activity piece, but also the air quality and pollution piece. So this is some recent research looking at heart disease and diabetes and the prevalence of those based on income. So as you can see, for the younger cohorts in these studies, on the lower income end of the spectrum, the darker blues, we see much higher prevalence for both heart disease and diabetes. As we get into the 80-plus age group, we see that leveling out. But in those younger years, we definitely see a relationship there. Similarly, another study that talked about prevalence of diabetes, asthma, obesity, and sedentary lifestyles or inactivity also showed a very strong link between incomes and the prevalence of these problems. Injury and death, rarely do you see such a linear relationship, but we have deaths per 100,000 people. And I guess I don't even say this, but this is taken from a recent study that was published in Governing Magazine. So they did a big feature on this issue of income disparity and pedestrian fatalities. So here we can see that in census tract group, census tracts with a poverty rate less than 5%, 3.8 deaths per 100,000. And in census tracts where the poverty rate was 30% or higher, up to 12.6 per 100,000. So a big difference here that we need to be paying attention to. There's also some disparities based on race and ethnicity. So even after controlling for exposure, black and Hispanic men are considerably more likely, have higher rates of fatalities as pedestrians. Okay, so back to these relationships. So when we're talking about these very important outcomes, health, economic, opportunity, and safety, it's easy to look at this relationship. And right over here, this is sort of as planners and engineers, this is where we focus a lot of our attention. So we know that these outcomes are place-based because of this relationship that research has shown again and again. But I think an important thing that we all need to think of as transportation planners is that place is housing-based. So if we don't have housing that allows people to live in these places, that support the travel behavior, that produce the positive outcomes or reduce the negative outcomes, then we're going to have a disconnect before this relationship is even able to start. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how we can start making some connections. And one piece of research that I've done recently that starts to look at some of these relationships between affordable housing and places where people can have these travel behaviors that will, we hope, produce the outcomes, the positive outcomes. So as I said more or less in the title, affordable housing can be seen as a requirement for an equitable transportation system. So this is not new to be saying this. This is not an earth-shattering proclamation. So we have a lot of examples. We have this increasing knowledge that transportation costs need to be part of the housing cost calculation. And we have a lot of new tools that help individuals, but also policymakers, understand this combined cost of place that is so important in determining whether or not someone can live in a place. So we have this, the Center for Neighborhood Technology has a tool called the Housing Plus Transportation Affordability Index. If you haven't checked this out, I would recommend it. It allows you to put in your address or look at a city or a region and see places where the combined cost of housing and transportation is considered affordable or unaffordable. We also have this location affordability portal. So HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has put this tool together. Again, a tool that is based on helping people make better decisions about where they live to be able to balance these costs of housing and transportation. So the basic idea that if you are spending more money on housing, if you're spending less money on housing, which is often the cost that we consider first when we're making a decision about where to live, we may think of the transportation cost as secondary, but there often is a relationship between those two, so it's really important to think about them together. So these tools are great, but as we know, there is this kind of basic economic principle that when we improve the transportation system in a place, we increase the accessibility, we're going to increase the property values. So we've seen evidence of this, and a lot of researchers look for evidence on this. So we have Joe Courtwright did a national study looking at relationships between walk scores and property values. Here's a study from Washington, D.C., and these are just a couple. So what we're seeing here is again, this fairly basic relationship between improved accessibility and land prices, which translates into housing cost. So these relationships are often used to justify transportation spending, and to some degree, very rightfully so. So in the early days of new light rail construction in the early 1990s, a lot of studies showing that a new light rail station going into a place would increase the property values was used as justification for further expansion of the system because we have some real benefits from increasing those property values. We see more tax revenue. We see developers starting to pay more attention to the land and be willing to develop at higher densities, which, if done in the right way, can help alleviate some of our affordable housing issues. But we also can see an amplification of affordable housing, the affordable housing shortages that we're already seeing, because as those prices increase, especially if the new denser development isn't happening, we'll see the prices for housing go up and up. One other problem with this scenario is that with increasing incomes in an area, we also often see an increase in vehicle ownership, which actually leads to a decrease in transit use. So it can have sort of this, even though we're increasing the density, we're getting more people, we're not seeing the increase in transit use that we would like to see and that would support our transit systems. So some of my previous research, so this is from my dissertation, looked at these barriers to lower income households being able to locate into these areas. So I was looking specifically at walkability or pedestrian accessibility. So in this data that I collected from 6 different cities, looking at people, recent movers, the proportion of respondents who had expressed a strong preference for a pedestrian accessible housing location that ended up in a very walkable neighborhood, and here I break it down by income, 53.4, so just over half of the higher income respondents were able to match their preference with the walkability of the place that they moved, versus less than 20% of the lower income group. So we're seeing, again, one of these important disparities. So a big a bigger chunk of this lower income group is not able to realize that preference. So in that same data set, I was able to look at the pedestrian accessibility of the new home based on when that move happened and also by income. So sort of pinpointed, this 2008 and after period, where in these 6 cities at least, we started to see more of a disparity in what people were able to access. So, and a lot of people point to 2008 as sort of this kind of turning point when this focus and this attention and repopularization of urban living really started to take hold in at least some cities in the U.S. So this, I'll go over this very briefly. Again, this is just background from my dissertation. So this is looking at people's expectation of how much they were going to be spending on transportation. So I looked at the entire sample, and about half and half. Some thought that their transportation costs were going to increase. Some thought they would decrease. When I start breaking it down by income, you start to see some disparity. So the high income group, more people thought that their transportation costs were going to decrease. As we get into lower income groups, the proportion of people who thought their transportation costs would increase started to go up. And one interesting finding on that really helped spur this interest of mine in affordable housing and helped to launch the 2 studies that I'm going to mention in a moment, was that then when we looked at the group that was getting some sort of housing subsidy, we saw it sort of revert back to being pretty close to what we're seeing for the entire sample. The caveat here is that this was not a huge sample, so this housing subsidy group was quite small. So I'm cautious about interpreting that, but it did point to a pattern that I wanted to explore further once I got out of this building. So again, back to this relationship. So we focus a lot on this built environment piece as planners and engineers. I've already made the case that I think we need to be thinking more about affordable housing and not just leaving that to the housing people or just calling them up on the phone and saying, hey, we need to coordinate, but actually making it part of what we all do as transportation professionals to make it front and center. So let's now get into, and this is just a teaser of a, I think I saw, Ryan, are you here? There you are. So this is some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years with Ryan, Dan, and Andre Tremolay, who I don't think is here, but 2 of PSU's finest. And we wanted to look at the Housing Choice Voucher Program in Portland and the Portland region to see how movers, and again, kind of following up on this idea of that disparity in movers based on income, to see how moves affected the location efficiency of where these low-income households were living. So the basic question was, how do housing choice voucher movers in the Portland region fare in terms of location efficiency? So, transportation being a big piece of this, access to transit, density of where you're living, and actually, I realize I have a definition of this in a later slide, so hold any question. So what we found is that in Portland, housing choice voucher movers ended up with lower levels of location efficiency than their previous home, and housing choice movers also had lower location efficiency than non-movers. So the people that stayed put during our study period were better off in terms of location efficiency than the people who moved. So one of the things that we're thinking here is that because the housing market in Portland is so tight and the neighborhoods with the best accessibility and location efficiency are the ones that are becoming very popular and very expensive, we're going to see bigger barriers for low-income households, even with the subsidy provided by the voucher. If we looked in the suburbs as a comparison group, we did not see those same relationships. So housing choice voucher movers, their location efficiency stayed approximately the same or even increased. And then there were no differences between mover and non-movers. So this is just a quick teaser. This work has just been published. Andre just walked into the room. So I hope that very soon she and Ryan will be able to share more details from this study. But and hopefully be published soon.
Can you explain what a housing choice voucher is and who it's given out to?
Yes. So housing choice voucher, so within affordable housing, there are unit-based subsidies, and then there are tenant-based subsidies. So the unit-based subsidy would be something like a public housing building. So all the units are owned by the housing authority. With the housing choice voucher program, sometimes known as Section 8, it's a voucher that goes to an individual or a family to be able to provide a subsidy to go out in the private rental market and rent. So that the cost is capped at about 30% of the household income. So, and I will say, as much as I think about affordable housing, I'm doing some of this work with people who are very much experts in affordable housing. So I can answer that question, but there may be some questions about the intricacies, especially of the low-income housing tax credit program, that I don't know as much. But thanks for the question. So again, Portland seeing some differences that we were not seeing in the suburbs, but more on that later. So the project that I want to talk the most about today is one that I'm doing with some colleagues at the University of Arizona, Gary Pivo and Drew Sanderford. And again, these are the housing experts, the real estate development experts that I'm teaming up with. And the basic question, so the low-income housing tax credit program is separate from the two that I just mentioned. But it's basically a tax credit, a federal tax credit that provides money and incentive for private developers, sometimes nonprofits, to develop housing that over a period of time is required to remain affordable at certain affordability thresholds. So it's, as you'll see in a second, one of the largest ways that we build affordable housing in this country. So the question here is whether this LIHTC program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, for units in this program built between 2007 and 2011, are they being located in location-efficient places? We also wanted to see if state policies, so these state housing allocation plans, or QAPs, qualified allocation plans, are making a difference. So these are competitively awarded tax credits. So each state can come up with their own way of prioritizing which projects get these tax credits. We also wanted to see if the share of LIHTC being built by nonprofits in a state made a difference in how location efficient those units were. So here, and this is the slide that I should have had a few ago, but here you can see the shifts in the different types of affordable housing, federally subsidized housing. So you can see, so the LIHTC program started in 1986, but has quickly become one of the largest, or the biggest ways that the federal government helps with the creation of new affordable housing units. So there's a long history here, but we can see that these project-based, so public housing units and project-based Section 8 have been declining as a share compared to LIHTC and the tenant-based Section 8. And there were some policy shifts in the 1990s that led to that change. So the big players right now are Section 8 and LIHTC, or housing choice vouchers on LIHTC. So we need to come up with some measures of location efficiency. And for this, we turn to the EPA's Smart Location Database. And we looked through all the data. So this is a nationwide data set that goes down to the census block group level. So we based on the availability of data there, we came up with kind of our criteria for establishing what is a location-efficient place. So we looked at residential density, street network connectivity, transit supportive, and this was a tough one. So we basically said if there are 5% or more of people in a place riding transit, that there must be some kind of transit infrastructure there, so that otherwise there would not be that many people riding. And 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of transit ridership, that's very high compared to the national average. So we also looked at whether a LIHTC unit was built within a half mile of rail transit. And then we also looked at a measure of the relative regional accessibility. So this is basically how well positioned a place is in terms of employment around the region. So those were the measures that we used. We had one more. This should be bulleted. So we also looked at the location affordability index to see, and this is a HUD, right? A HUD measure. So location affordability index creates for a hypothetical household what at different income levels what the transportation costs might be or predicted to be. So we looked at places in this definition that were less, for this low-income household, spending less than 20% of their household income on transportation costs. So for the analysis, we looked at national and states. And the reason that we stopped at the states is that we wanted to test the effect of those state policies. And one of our follow-up to this study is going to be to dig a little bit deeper and go to the metro level to see if differences in local policies or local practices are having an impact. So this is a fairly rough look at the state level. So we also compared so we needed to look to see what percentage of LIHTC in a state was in a location-efficient place. But you can imagine that a place like New York is going to have a lot more location efficiency overall to begin with. So we needed to have some way of sort of looking to see how a state is doing given where they started out, sort of that basic urban form piece. So we compared the location efficiency of LIHTC to the location efficiency of all housing in that state. So again, a rather crude comparison, but we thought that this would show us kind of who's overperforming given their baseline. So here for the nation, we can see, and pay no attention to the map, it's just the U.S., in case you weren't aware. Nothing fancy is going to happen on this map yet. So pay attention to the bar chart here. But you can see, so this is the share of units that meet location efficiency criteria that we have set. So the density transit at 5%, connectivity, job access, rail transit station within a half mile, and transportation affordability at 20% of income or less. And then we averaged all those to create this LIHTC location efficiency score. So you can see that all housing average in the U.S. About 12 or 13%. But if we look just at LIHTC, that jumps up to an average up there at 30%, and you can see the breakdown by each measure that we used. So we also looked to see how many LIHTC units, what percentage of LIHTC units are being built in census block groups that meet 3 or more of these criteria that we set. And we found that 36% of them are, which again, this is much higher than what we would see for housing in general. So we do see some evidence that, and not surprisingly, LIHTC is being concentrated in more location-efficient places. So here we can see state by state. So here we've got, this is across all of the measures. So this is sort of overall location efficiency. We're looking at LIHTC in blue, and then this differential is basically the difference between the all housing number and the LIHTC number. So, and this is ranked by that overperformance versus the rest of the housing stock. So we can see some of the top performers in terms of getting more LIHTC in location-efficient places than you would expect. So just really quickly going through state by state to show you what some of the top performers, and this is just a really rough, top 10 in each category. But we can see a cluster in the Northeast, Colorado, New Mexico, Wisconsin, Washington, and Oregon in terms of putting more LIHTC or outperforming in terms of putting LIHTC in dense places. For connectivity, Oregon, Montana, New Mexico, Missouri, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and South Carolina. For regional accessibility, again, this job measure, and I'm not going to read through every single name. It's a geography test. I'm trusting you know what most of these states are. I'm really glad to be giving this talk in Oregon because you will see that Oregon is popping up again and again. So in terms of transit use, and this pattern is a little bit different. So this gave us a little bit of pause about our transit measure, but we still went ahead and used it because we thought it was an important piece to include. Being near rail transit, again, some clustering in the Northeast, Midwest, and then the West Coast. And then transportation costs being under 20%. And so some definite patterns are emerging here. So then here you can see when we average them all, this is basically the same thing that I showed you on that bar chart with the top 10. Some we expected to see on this list, some surprised us a little bit. So the next step was to try to figure out what's going on here and to test the effect of these main questions we had in terms of state policy and the role of nonprofits. So we were able to show that there was a relationship between whether or not a state QAP, qualified allocation plan, prioritized certain location-efficient characteristics, and also the share of LIHTC that was developed by nonprofit organizations or developers in a state. We do think that those are, it was not a terribly strong relationship, but we do think that there is some impact of that. So in conclusion for this research, LIHTC is more location efficient than other housing. Again, not terribly surprising, but something worth saying. But there's also the potential for LIHTC to be a lot more location efficient. We saw 36% of LIHTC being built in places that were meeting 3 of these criteria. So that leaves room for growth. We did think, based on this, that policy, statewide policy, and nonprofits do make a difference. And I think we see that here in the Portland region in terms of some of the nonprofits that are active here. So kind of good news, but we also need to keep in mind that the Housing Choice Voucher Program and LIHTC while they are the biggest that we have in terms of providing affordable housing, they're not enough. I think in the Portland region here, and Andre, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 20,000 people are on the waiting list for the Housing Choice Voucher. So these programs, while they are doing some good, are not keeping pace. So there is a need to think beyond just these specific programs or specific projects. One of the big limitations from this work is that we don't directly address the potential risk of putting LIHTC in location-efficient places of further concentrating poverty. And this is something that I think is maybe more relevant in some bigger East Coast and Midwestern cities. But it is possible that by prioritizing these location-efficient places based on the measures that we have, that this will put a bigger concentration of low-income housing in central city areas where there's already a high concentration of poverty. I think we are seeing some shifts in terms of we talk a lot about millennials returning to urban areas, but there are a lot of places where there's still these really concentrated enclaves of poverty, and we need to be aware of this concern. So some of our next steps are to look at metro area areas to make comparisons and do some of the same analysis. and also to look at the effect of QAP changes. So we have a pretty good record of when states make changes to their QAPs to see if, after some lag period, if that starts having an effect on where these are built. So some broad lessons now, from this kind of bigger look at affordable housing and transportation. What are some lessons for transportation planners? And I should have put engineers on here as well, because I think you all fall into the category as well of these broader transportation professionals. So one thing to not do, don't just simply say, if we improve transportation in a place, it's going to displace people, and so we should just leave things alone. There are really serious transportation obstacles that people face in terms of health and safety and access. So this is really not an option. So I think we need to be more proactive and think about these things more holistically. And I say this in part because I sometimes sense this with my students. When we talk about some of the challenges of displacement and people being priced out and property value increases, there's this tendency to sort of step back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't do anything. And I think that that's not the way we should go. But things to do. So including a goal of preserving and creating affordable housing from the beginning of any large transportation projects. And there are some great examples of this around, some agencies that are getting really serious about including this. Related to leveraging transportation funding. So TriMet has done some great things. Federal Transit Administration has gotten a little bit more flexible in terms of what money for new transportation projects can be spent on. So here we're talking about big light rail projects that might allow you to buy property, and a great example here in Portland up on the interstate line to actually sell that property to a developer at a loss as an incentive to have new affordable housing built. So also, we've seen this a little bit more, but making affordable housing central to the mission of transportation agencies. There's been a big conversation recently in Los Angeles about LA Metro actually changing sort of one of the pieces of their mission to include providing building with the money that they have affordable housing, and also using some of the money that they get from the federal government to leverage more. So again, this recognition that these issues are very much linked, and that the transportation agencies need to be thinking about them. Also, there are ways to capture some of that value from land increases that we do see. But the catch here, because a lot of places do have ways to capture this value, but the really important piece is to be sure that you're putting that back into the right pot of money, to put that into a fund that will help develop affordable housing. Also, getting creative. One of the examples that I love, this was a highway project in, I think, Louisville, Kentucky, where planners went in and heard concerns from the community that the property values were going to increase and people were worried about being displaced. So the transportation professionals, teaming up with others, were able to put a plan in place to create a community land trust that allowed people who were living there to buy the homes, but to not have to buy the land underneath the homes, so that was owned by this community land trust. So it all of a sudden made it affordable for these people to buy rather than just renting, because when you're renting, you're more at risk of being displaced as property values go up. Then you're also getting some of that equity as the property values increase, and you're more likely to be able to stay in the community. So for transportation students, take a housing class. There are a lot of these things that I did not know until 6 years into grad school. And I think it's really important to have this kind of cross-pollination. And when I say transportation students here, if there are any of you here who are transportation people who are not students, this applies to you as well. You're here, so you're learning, you're a student. I Yeah, and that one, it's may sound silly, but I think it really is important to understand this terminology, understand how all this housing stuff works. And again, thank you to Andre. Working with her on some of these projects has been a great education for me and really learning how these systems work. So very last thing, very quickly. So this is the American Institute of Certified Planners Code of Ethics. So just a few points from their principles to which we aspire. So we shall have special concern for long-range consequences of present actions. I think this fits nicely in with what we're talking about. We should pay special attention to the interrelatedness of decisions. So again, transportation and housing are very much linked. We need to be thinking about all these things holistically as transportation planners. And lastly, I'm not going to read this one, but basically we need to be paying attention to social equity in everything that we do. It can't be an afterthought. It needs to be right there front and center from day one of planning a new project. So with that, thank you, and I would be happy to hear your comments and questions. Or do I call on? Do I call on people? Okay. You were fast.
My name is David Warner with Civil Engineering. I was wanting to clarify the early graph that you showed of the fatality rates by census block.
Yes.
Is that population-related data or is it place-related data? I.e., if I'm low income, am I more likely to get hit by a car? Or if I am in a low-income area, am I more likely to get hit by a car?
Place-based. So if you are living in, so those are the rates, fatality rates for census tracts. Yeah.
Two questions. First, I'm unfamiliar with LIHTC. Is that a end-of-year tax credit that individuals receive once they've done their taxes? If so, is it considered to be that effective? Because low-income individuals, they need the money then rather than.
So it's a tax credit for developers. So we're talking, a lot of really big scale developers take advantage of this. And the details of how that all works, I'll trip over myself all over the place. But that's the basics. So thinking bigger picture.
Does the increase in vehicle ownership that comes from increased income happen in areas that already have a good transit system in place, the same as areas that don't? Or is it something that really only happens when there's not already transit?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer for that. My guess would be that it could actually be a bigger effect sort of the other way of what you're talking about. So I do think whether or not there is transit already there, we do see some pretty strong relationships between income and car ownership. And obviously we see big relationships between car ownership and driving. But I'm not familiar enough. I have not done any of that research myself, so I'm not quite sure the answer to that question.
One more quick follow-up. Yeah. Do you think that relationship, though, is likely to change with the millennials who are owning less cars?
So I think that there are a lot of people who would like to see that change, and I think that it probably is shifting slightly. But I do think, and I think this is a challenge that Portland is facing, is that we have all this housing that we want to attract a certain type of person to, but I think those people are often coming with more cars than we would like. And I don't know, actually, if anybody's looked at TriMet ridership and this specific question in some of these neighborhoods where we've been seeing a lot of infill, if we're seeing the transit ridership increase that you'd expect, or if this sort of income piece is playing a role in car ownership. Does anybody know if anybody's looked at that here? Okay. Good research project. Yeah. Yeah.
Transportation. You mentioned earlier, or you might have mentioned it earlier, but I just wanted to clarify. You said that there was a waiting list for the subsidy, maybe you're like 20,000 people or so. Is this purely just a funding issue, or is there something else?
Yes. Yeah, and I should clarify that's for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, not for the LIHTC program. Yeah, and they were so during this last recession we had, big cuts to lots of federal programs, and I think just in the last year, at least in Portland, and I'm looking at you, Andre, because you can nod if I'm right, but they were finally able to start taking some people off the waiting list after probably 4 or 5 years of not even being able to bring any, 2 or 3 years of not being able to bring anybody off the waiting list. Aaron.
The LIHTC program scores project applicants.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you looked at whether this pattern you find actually reflects the scoring of projects, so that ones that have higher transit capacity get scored higher in, say, South Carolina or wherever. Or is there a national scoring? And I guess it's how well does the QAP goals translate into the scoring?
Yeah, and so we looked through all 50 states' QAPs for, I think, 4 years ago and looked at them for a couple different years. And there's so much variation in how they prioritize things. So some of them give points. So you'll get bonus points if you're near transit. Some of them, and there's some research that says that this is more effective if you actually have a set aside. So a certain number or a certain amount of your allocated tax credits have to go into areas that are, served well by rail transit. But in our analysis, we did a pretty, rough look at just whether or not some of these things were prioritized. We were not confident that actually going in and kind of quantifying, how many points that we would see, that we'd be able to pick up on that variation, again, with just 50 data points. A good question.
You talked about mixed income development as a possible approach for reducing that concentration while still providing access and efficiency.
I think that it can be a great model. I think there are, it's the same challenges in terms of the lack of resources to provide enough. But the one nice thing about the mixed income is that you can use the market rate to subsidize the affordable housing, which can be make it easier.
You said that you used the census block group level to analyze demographic data and density. Have you or did you consider using asymmetric mapping methods to actually get down to real density levels?
No. And we, partly because this was, we wanted to use data that was already currently available. For doing something nationwide like this, and on a shoestring budget, being able to actually go collect that more fine-grained level of data would have been very challenging. So, but it is definitely a limitation. There's a lot of, and I think smaller and larger. Some of these things, it's possible that a larger unit of analysis would be more appropriate because you're really looking at a larger neighborhood effect. So a lot of questions around that.
Concerning the topics of pedestrian injury and death, I was pretty taken aback by the disparities in by race, ethnicity, and income. I was curious if you were aware if emergency vehicle response time figured into those figures.
Good question. I do not know, but it is entirely possible, and it would be not a difficult thing to test, just to see if proximity to emergency healthcare services is correlated with that disparity. Okay, lots of hands now. Let's.
About with 344 sample size, it was location efficiency and housing choice voucher. Was that national or was it a specific state?
That was looking at sampling in 6 different cities that were selected based on a number of criteria.
About doing a city-specific study on that? Because I would imagine that location efficiency and Section 8 voucher holder.
Oh, wait, I may be confusing because there was one where, yes, I think I was misspeaking. So that the housing choice voucher. We are doing some work in Portland specifically.
So that one where it was said location efficiency, and if you moved
Yes, that was Portland specific, or Portland region specific. Yes. Well, that was a different study. The 344 was not housing choice voucher specific. For that one, it was 2,000, about 2,000 housing choice voucher movers that we had. So. No, that one was just local. Yeah. Yeah.
Towards the beginning of your presentation, you had a slide on how, health outcomes, and one of the categories was sedentary.
Yes.
And I found it very interesting that the rich tended to be much more sedentary, but the poor had worse health outcomes, and that makes me wonder if food is much more central than exercise.
Good question.
Something else.
I need to refresh my memory on that one. This? No, this.
Yeah. So 74% of the wealthy are higher income are sedentary. I found that interesting. I don't know why it would be so high.
No, that is interesting. And I will also. What type of job they have? Yeah, it's possible because physical activity as measured in this data set from the CDC is not just about transportation. So it's if you're working in your job, if you're working in your garden, so that could be part of it.
But they have really low diabetes rates. Obesity's lower.
So I will also double check just to make sure that I didn't swap my numbers here. But does anybody who's seen this before, is that surprising?
Because higher income people have better access to healthcare and have their diabetes treated and their asthma treated. So they'll have lower rates of that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one factor.
Yeah.
Another part of it is food access.
Well, oh no, sorry. I think I see what you're saying now. So sedentary.
You have a white collar job, so you don't move as much.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if it's like how they're eating or more the healthcare access.
Right.
It's multifaceted.
For sure. Yeah, and these are very complex relationships, and it's an area where there's actual links between physical activity and what type of physical activity and how much physical activity are really important. And even this data set doesn't always do the best job at getting us the detail that we need. Yeah.
I'm curious what measure you used for employment accessibility. Was that transit specific or just general employment?
Just general. There is a transit specific one in there, but one of the limitations with this data set is that they get their transit information from Google, and not every transit agency gives their data to Google, so we were not able to use that transit piece. Yeah.
I've just been curious about this over the last couple of years, we're seeing housing prices increase near these more walkable areas.
Mm-hmm.
In the consideration of all of this and planning for the future, are you aware of demographics and families aging being a part of it? Like, do people predict that the same properties and the same kind of access to transportation is going to be popular with, let's say, a family of kids, and they now, I mean, is the estimate or the trajectory looking the same, or are people thinking people want to go back to the suburbs?
So I think a lot of people are waiting, holding their breath right now to see, as the economy starts picking up steam, are we going to revert back to the normal trends that we've seen for the last 50 years, or are we actually seeing fundamental changes? I think there's some evidence that we are seeing some changes that are going to stick around. I think we are seeing, and I think even school populations in central cities here in Portland are started after a long time of decline. They're at least stabilizing, if not increasing. But yeah, that would be my guess. Tara.
And it seems like that could either be a sign that LIHTC is working well, or that the general housing stock is really bad, like a big differential. And I'm just curious about if you have a sense of how many people fall into that, where they don't qualify for big A, big H affordable housing, but like they also can't afford, these places that have the housing stock that are just out of their reach.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. There's sort of this gap. So LIHTC, there is a little bit more. I mean, So there is a need for affordable housing at lots of different, percentages of the median income. But I think that's another reason that we can't just rely on these programs, that we really need to, start thinking about supply more broadly. Jennifer?
So on your regression analysis where the differential, the LIHTC differential was the outcome measure, and you focused on, so your hypothesis was whether or not the state plans had an influence, and it appears that perhaps they did. What I wasn't clear about, and I easily could have missed it, it seems so clearly there's other state and regional policies. So when you were going through your maps and like Oregon keeps popping up, and like on connectivity, I think, well, the transportation planning rule is working because we have more connected streets in Oregon than other states, for example. And so, and then, Washington doesn't show up on rail because particularly when you did the sample, they didn't have any rail.
Yeah.
So to what extent can you account for some of these other land use and or transportation policies?
So we did look, we tried to find some other measures that others have developed. So there's the WRLRI, I never remember what the acronym is, the Wharton, something about sort of how strict land use controls are in a state. And we also looked, one of the things that we initially looked at was the per capita FTA New Starts funding to see if these states that are investing heavily in rail are going to be, but didn't really see much shaking out there. But this was ideally we would be able to go in and really investigate, and we may do this with some of the more metro level. So if we're just looking at a handful of metro areas to see the ones that really stand out. We can go in and look at a little bit more detail, but again, at the national level, we struggled to find good measures of that. But I think sort of a case study approach would be good to follow up on some of these that are really, overperforming to see why that might be the case, and maybe looking at the underperformers as well.
Michael, location efficiency is a new term to me. And I was wondering, with the bike-oriented development we're seeing in Portland, if that is taken into account by location efficiency.
So yeah, we did not have any explicit, measure of bike network connectivity. I think that you would probably see some correlations between the street network connectivity and just sort of density in terms of bicycling. I think that's a great question to explore further in terms of whether, and I think you'd probably need to pinpoint, because again, if we look at bike mode share across the U.S., it's tiny. But if you can start looking at some local examples like Portland, and you might be able to tease out some of that effect.
On the list of dues, there was one bullet point that said capture value for land increases. Put it in the right bucket. I'm not sure what you mean exactly by that. Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So tax increment financing is an example of where we expect property values to increase. So we basically say that anything, for a period of time, any tax revenue that comes in that's more than the baseline that's set at year one will go into some fund. So this is how urban renewal districts can be operated. But I think one of the challenges, and I think you've seen this in Portland, is what happens with that money. And that there's been some examples recently of goals for affordable housing set that have not been met. So just making sure that again from the start that money is going to be allocated to where it's most needed. And I would make the case that affordable housing needs to be very high on that priority list.
we have Jeffrey Rosenblum from Northeastern and MIT to talk about Depot Street in Boston. Let's thank Dr. Adkins for his.